controlled studies has really exploded in the last number of years. And we can feel a lot more confident, I think, in some of their findings because a lot of these studies have been done with really good quality investigators and really well-designed studies. And even the problem, though, is that even when we get those studies published, we don't often hear about them, right? The media doesn't pick them up. They often don't make it into the medical community, despite their really, the good design of their studies. If you compare that to when a pharmaceutical study is done, it often makes the headlines and makes the news. So let's look at some of these chemicals or botanicals and phytochemicals today. So our objectives are really to look at the evidence for using select phytochemicals, botanicals, as both anti-inflammatory and analgesic agents, because pain is a really big issue in autoimmune conditions, and we really want to use their analgesic properties as well. And then to identify the most appropriate phytochemicals and botanicals for specific inflammatory and pain conditions, so specific diseases. And then first of all, before we jump into that, I want to really quickly review some of the mechanisms of the pharmaceuticals that are very commonly prescribed for inflammatory and autoimmune conditions. Even some of the newer biologics that we've referred to a little bit, I want to kind of go into them and look at how they work and some of their drawbacks. And then we'll delve into these botanicals that are at our disposal. So before we do that, I know you've all seen this before. I showed it to you yesterday. It's to remind you that nearly all degenerative diseases have as part of their underlying biochemical etiology is this pro-inflammatory state or inflammation, and that inflammation is really a final common pathway for all of these different dysfunctions. Now, in this module, we're really focusing on the ones that are in the circles, but these ones as well: diabetes, Alzheimer's, atherosclerosis, cancer, even some of the psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia and depression. All of them have inflammation as one of their root causes. And again, just to remind you, when you see things over and over again, those of you who are going for certification, always pay attention when you see a slide come up multiple times. That's just a little hint for you. So just to make sure we're on the same page, most chronic diseases are linked to excessive persistent inflammation. I think we've pounded that point home well enough. Chronic inflammation occurs when the injury is ongoing or when a predisposed immune system just doesn't shut off, right? It fails at counter-regulation. And then an acute inflammation, which is really beneficial, can turn into a chronic inflammation. And that the conventional pharmacological treatment really focuses on specific pathways that are often really downstream in that inflammatory process. And so we really, from a functional medicine perspective, as we'll look at, really want to look a bit more upstream. So there's a number of different classes of pharmaceutical drugs that we're really, I think, pretty familiar with, and they can affect the inflammatory pathway in a number of different ways. So for example, the NSAIDs inhibit the COX enzyme, leukotriene inhibitors, the LOX, as you know. DMARDs, they can have a number of different, affect a number of different mechanisms. So DMARDs like methotrexate can inhibit monocyte, lymphocyte, pro-inflammatory cytokines, as well as other mechanisms we'll get into in a minute. Biologics can inhibit different cytokines, and the common one is TNF-alpha. And then steroids can inhibit NF-kappa B and phospholipase A2 as well. Again, I know you've seen this one as well. So again, a hint, an inflammatory trigger, right? Can be food, can be toxins, can trigger NF-kappa B, which dissociates from I-kappa B and goes into the nucleus, binds to DNA, leads to the transcription of a number of different genes. So those genes make RNA gets turned into DNA, and it turns on all of these different inflammatory pathways. And you can see these X's here are where some of the pharmaceuticals act. So the biologics, they inhibit TNF-alpha and some of the other cytokines like the IL-6 inhibitors. You have the leukotriene inhibitors like Singulair, which hit that lipoxygenase. NSAIDs hit the COX enzyme. And then the corticosteroids have a really overall anti-inflammatory, dampens really the whole immune system by focusing on that NF-kappa B. So let's start looking with the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, or the NSAIDs. These NSAIDs are really ubiquitous. I mean, has anybody here, and I can't see the chat right now, but I'd love it if you guys, is there one of you out there that has never taken an NSAID in their life? I think that most of us have taken an NSAID. They're just so common. A lot of people use them like candy, right? They're the first thing you reach for when you have any kind of pain. A lot of people use them on a daily basis. And the reason they use them is because they do work. They inhibit that cyclooxygenase enzymes, and they prevent those inflammatory prostaglandins, which cause inflammation and cause pain. Now, paracetamol is on here, or acetaminophen, that's another name for it. It's not technically an NSAID, so we're going to look at that one separately. But these NSAIDs, aren't without issues, as I'm going to show you a little bit later. Despite the fact that, 70 million prescriptions for NSAIDs are written in the US alone every year, and that over-the-counter uses included 30 billion doses of NSAIDs. I mean, that's an enormous amount, and no wonder most of us have taken them. We're part of that 30 billion. But I'm going to show you a little bit later, even one dose can lead to transient leaky gut. We know their association with things like peptic ulcers and GI bleeding. And as you heard Dr. Fitzgerald say yesterday, they can inhibit that resolving pathway as well, which is so important to shut off the inflammatory response. So let's look at DMARDs, or the disease-modifying anti-rheumatic agents. They're really the first-line therapy for rheumatoid arthritis. And one of the reasons they're the first-line therapy is that they're really quite inexpensive, but they are slow-acting, and they do decrease inflammation, but they don't really work very well to directly relieve pain. So methotrexate is, this one, hydroxychloroquine or Plaquenil is a very well-known one right now, especially with its use in COVID. But methotrexate actually inhibits RNA and DNA synthesis, which is why it's been used as a chemotherapy agent in cancer. And when it inhibits, it does that by inhibiting dihydrofolate reductase, which is needed to make DNA and RNA. But it also suppresses T and B cell activation, and it inhibits IL-1 beta from binding to its receptor. So unfortunately, even though they're the first line therapy, they do come with a number of fairly severe side effects. But we keep talking about this idea of side effects. It's not really side effects. They're actually direct effects of the medication. They may be unwanted effects, but they're not really side effects. Some of these unwanted effects are things like rashes, stomach upset, liver, bone marrow toxicity, birth defects, and then, of course, which we're going to see over and over again, anytime that you shut down your immune system, you open yourself up for infections. So you become much more susceptible to infections. So let's look at these DMARDs. These are the newer, the biologic DMARDs, So these are these newer biologic medications. There's currently 5 TNF alpha blockers. They work by curbing either T cell activation, blocking TNF, which is the most common one, but they also can block things like IL-6, deplete T cells, and work in other ways. Now, these biologics, they're called biologics because they're actually monoclonal antibodies. And so these monoclonal antibodies, as antibodies do, they have very strong specific binding affinities. And so the use of antibodies as medications, if you think about it, has been a pretty great advance. Now, as we're going to see, they may not be the ultimate solution for treating autoimmune disease, but they hold a lot of promise, especially when we need their specificity. So, you don't always want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just keep that in mind. So let's jump to a polling question. Let's, just throw it in there. Name a condition for which NSAIDs, DMARDs, or biologic DMARDs are used. Again, just to remind you, hyphenate, there's ankylosing spondylitis, really good. Hyphenate if it's more than one. So I see ankylosing spondylitis. What's another condition? Psoriasis, absolutely. Used a lot in psoriasis. Where else would we use them? I think it takes a few minutes to jump in. It's probably a few more than ankylosing spondylitis and psoriasis where we'd use biologics, NSAIDs. Remember, NSAIDs as well. I sort of pain positive RA, Crohn's. Here we go. Yeah. Yeah, you do see them used in fibromyalgia. Well, definitely NSAIDs are used in fibromyalgia, that's for sure. Yeah, lupus, yeah, menstrual pain, for sure you use NSAIDs. There's no question there. Very true. Definitely, I think you could probably throw in any disease, and we'd at least have tried an NSAID, and definitely any autoimmune disease is where those DMARDs or biologics have been used. So great. I see a plantar. I'm not quite sure what that is. Biggest one, arthritis, psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis. Absolutely. Definitely. Okay, so these biologic DMARDs, as I've said, they can be very powerful drugs, and they've also proven to be pretty lucrative for the pharmaceutical companies. And you can see there's billions of dollars in sales, and they've only been going up since 2016. So in 2019, the global sale for these biologics altogether was $289 billion. I mean, that's just a staggering amount if you think about it. And in 2014, a study was done of over 2,000 patients looking in the Humana database, and they were looked at patients who were taking these biologics. And they looked at how much money they actually spent. And it showed that, remember, this was back in 2014, that the mean annual cost per treated patient for new patients that were just diagnosed and just starting this was around $9,000 to $47,000 a year. And for continuing patients, so patients that were, not newly diagnosed and continuing on these medications, went up to over $180,000 a year. I mean, that's just a staggering amount of money. So these are the top selling biologic medications. Etanercept, which is otherwise known as Enbrel, adalimumab, otherwise known as Humira, infliximab, that one's called Remicade. These are all TNF alpha inhibitors, and they're used for a lot of different autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, psoriasis, ankylosing spondylitis. Those are the ones that you guys got really nicely in your word cloud, but they're also used for a lot of the other ones that you put in there. And the mean cost of treatment is somewhere around $25,000. Now, that's a lot of money, but if you think about it, it actually might be worthwhile if they actually cured autoimmune disease. I would gladly pay $25,000. Well, if I, make sure you have it, obviously, but if it worked, autoimmune diseases have terrible morbidity. That would be, it would be worth it. But the problem is, they don't work as well as we think. So, there's an analysis in this case, there's over 1,100 patients with rheumatoid arthritis. It showed that biologics were effective in only 25% of the patients overall when you took them all together. And these were the ones that were looked at. You can see that there. And that the total cost of rheumatoid arthritis medications per effectively treated patient ranged from $43,000 up to $86,000. So even though infliximab, this is really interesting, was the most expensive, it was also found to be the least effective, which was sometimes not surprising in the pharmaceutical world. And this is the American College of Rheumatology recommendations. They still recommend DMARDs like methotrexate as their first line of treatment. This is for rheumatoid arthritis. And then you can follow the flow chart down as the disease continues and you still have moderate to high activity, then you can add in the different biologics. And then if that fails, you can start to switch the biologics around and just sort of play around with what is going to get you a response. As I said, we've already talked about the high cost of these drugs. There's billions of dollars in sales that actually make these biologics the top overall category of all drug sales. So if you look at the top 10 drug sales, 7 of them are biologics that are used for autoimmune conditions. Now, this is the dollar cost. It's not the number of prescriptions, but it's actually the cost of the prescriptions. Actually, one of the things I wanted to mention back here is if you look at Humira, $19.9 billion is what they made. Now, Humira, a couple of years ago, was approved for orphan drug status to treat non-infectious uveitis. So they actually took advantage of, so the FDA has a lot of different financial incentives for companies to develop drugs, orphan drugs, right? So for some of those rare diseases. The company took advantage of all of those FDA incentives to use, to get Humira approved for as orphan drug status for non-infectious uveitis, despite the fact that millions of people are already using it and they've got billions of dollars in sales. Now, don't get me wrong, you know, good pharmaceuticals are important and we need treatments for these lesser known conditions, but it just kind of makes you wonder sometimes. So let's take a closer look at how well these medications actually work. We kind of touched on that already, but they don't work as well as, you know, I think we all, patients hope, insurance company hope. You know, in 2018, there was a systematic review, meta-analysis of over 82,000 patients, quite a few, and looked at the remission rates for rheumatoid arthritis that were taking these TNF blockers. And they looked over 6, 12, and 24 months. And the remission rates were, you know, anywhere from 16% up to 23%. So less than a quarter of people actually had remission from taking these drugs. And that the remission rates for TNF non-responders were, of course, much lower, 11 and 13%. And that some of the predictors, this was a little interesting, of remission were males, people who had higher education, and of course, lower baseline disease activity. So if their disease wasn't as bad, they had a better chance of remission, which kind of makes sense. And a sustained remission rate at 1 year varied anywhere between 7 to 37%. So not really great efficacy or effectiveness, I guess. So now, because of the significant adverse events or side effects, you know, the discontinuation rate is pretty high. So for example, over the first 5 years of treatment, approximately 50% of patients just stop their TNF inhibitor. They just stop using it, either because it stops working or because they have some kind of adverse effect. And in 8 years, the rate of withdrawal for patients on infliximab was 80%. So 80% of patients stopped taking it. And then it was down to 47% for etanercept. You know, and these, like I said, these adverse events are directly related to the action of the drug. You know, when you start to inhibit the immune system irreversibly, you're going to have some consequences. It just makes sense. Now, people end up discontinuing these drugs not only because the side effects, like I said, but they just stop working. So if you look at in the second bullet here, first one, fewer than half the patients sustain remission for more than a year. And if you follow these rheumatoid arthritis patients at their different office visits, 40% had remission at one sort of a single random visit. But if you required 2 visits in a row for them to have remission, not just one, 2 visits in a row, it actually went down to much lower, 20% here if you needed 2 visits in a row. And sustained clinical remission at 3, 4, and 5 year follow-ups was only 11%. So it looks like they do work well in the short term, but the long-term remission is really just not very good. You know, this brings up the big problem, and this is why we have a big problem with compliance. So first of all, I don't really like that word compliance. You know, it implies this hierarchical doctor-patient relationship where the doctor makes you comply to their treatment. But, you know, of course, in functional medicine, it's more of a therapeutic relationship that we have with our patients. And so I like to maybe use the word adherence or something like that. But, you know, adherence is a problem, and some of the problems are because it's so expensive. You know, it's a huge financial burden, even with people with insurance. You know, forking out $1,000 to $3,000 a month is just not sustainable for a lot of people. And then when you consider that a lot of people with autoimmune conditions just can't work, so they're on disability, they don't have insurance, it becomes really, really expensive. And so, of course, people just can't do it. It requires a lot of physician visits. You have to get to the doctor because most of these or a lot of them are administered intravenously. They require a very strict follow-up schedule. And then, of course, the big reason, as we've talked about, is they just stop working. And so why continue paying all that money for something that just doesn't work? Biologics can't cure, they can only slow the progression, and they have these long-term serious side effects that we talked about. And one of the reasons that biologics stop working is actually people can start to make these anti-drug antibodies. So they start to make antibodies to the medication. Now, this makes a lot of sense, right? If you think about these biologics, they're proteins, they're monoclonal antibodies. So they're biological proteins that we're injecting into people, and they then can elicit an immune response against them. So now the person starts making an antibody response against that monoclonal antibody or against the medication. And when you do that, when you start to have these anti-drug antibodies, you can block their therapeutic effect. So you can actually, the antibody binds to them and blocks and prevents them from working. That can also cause allergic and hypersensitivity reactions when you have an anti-drug antibody. And they're also disease related. So you see them higher in rheumatoid arthritis. It kind of makes sense, right? You are introducing a very potential antigenic medication in someone whose immune system is already imbalanced and much more likely to make abnormal immune responses. You see them mostly with the chimeric human marine antibodies. So that's the one. So we actually make antibodies. These drugs are made as a mouse human together. So pieces of mouse and pieces of human together. And of course, that will elicit a much higher immune response. So this really points to the challenge of long-term pharmacotherapy in general. Medications in general, 20 to 30% of medication prescriptions are never filled. So people will go to their doctor, the doctor will hand them a prescription. 20 to 30% of the time, they never go to the drugstore to fill it. And then of those who do, the medication is not continued as prescribed in 50% of the cases. And then they'll take it, sometimes they'll take it for a little while, and then after 6 months, they just stop taking it. So you can see that, the drop in prescriptions that are actually taken for longer than 6 months is really quite low. Okay, we've talked about NSAIDs and DMARDs and biologics. What about this acetaminophen? I mean, acetaminophen is another one that's just really widely used. And it's because it's put into all of these different cold and flu and pain products. They sneak it into so many different medications. You really have to read labels. Now, personally, I actually don't do really well with acetaminophen at all. And I think it's because I have 4 copies of the gene that metabolizes it into a very toxic intermediate. So when I take acetaminophen, I metabolize it very quickly. So it stops working very quickly into this toxic intermediate. And I end up getting a headache after I take acetaminophen because I'm this ultra rapid metabolizer. And then, of course, that toxic intermediate needs to be metabolized by glutathione. So then you use up your glutathione. Now, if I ever need a medication, and I've done this, I've gone to the drugstore, you have symptoms, you want some symptom control for a cold or a flu. I just can't find a product that doesn't have acetaminophen in it. It's really ubiquitous and everywhere. Now, how does acetaminophen, it doesn't actually inhibit any pathway-mediated receptors, and it doesn't have an anti-inflammatory response. So acetaminophen is a pain. It's used for pain control, but it's not an anti-inflammatory. We put it in this talk mostly because it's just so ubiquitous, and it's used in conjunction with a lot of different anti-inflammatories. And its costs are over $2 billion as well, found in over 200 over-the-counter as well as prescription medications. And I think one of the reasons that it's so bioavailable is that the contraindication of aspirin due to its association with Reye's syndrome in kids has just really led to the ubiquitous use of acetaminophen in children and adult products as well. So even though we don't know the exact site of how it works or exerts its analgesic effect, acetaminophen seems to increase the pain threshold. It may do this by inhibiting nitric oxide pathway mediated, mediated through these receptors for NMDA and substance P. So we still don't have a great handle on that, but that's how it appears to work. So, these drugs can be quite useful in the short term, but of course, long-term use has very serious side effects. Acetaminophen had a black box warning, which is the highest warning that the FDA gives for potential risk for severe liver injury and also potential allergic reactions. And that's pretty serious. It can have a hepatotoxic, like I said, because once you need glutathione in order to detoxify it. And if you have a lot of acetaminophen, you're going to use up your glutathione. And when your glutathione is gone, your liver is going to fail. And even in doses that aren't that big, just smaller doses, you can see transient elevations of some of their liver enzymes, the aminotransferases. And then for the NSAIDs, the Arthritis, Rheumatism, Aging Medical Information System, they've estimated over more than 100,000 hospitalizations and 16,000 deaths every year in the US that are due to NSAID complications. I mean, that's insane. We know they cause peptic ulcers and lead to GI bleeding. And that, of course, causes transient leaky gut as well. So in this particular study, there's 9 healthy men. They did a cycling exercise, and then some of them took 800 milligrams of ibuprofen and some didn't. And they looked at and showed that gastrointestinal inflammation, intestinal permeability were higher after that ibuprofen administration. This is a moderate dose. It's not even that high. It's just a single dose. And we're going to go over intestinal permeability a lot more tomorrow. But ibuprofen aggravates exercise-induced small intestinal injury and leads to gut barrier dysfunction. And like I said, that's a really important thing that we want to maintain is our gut barrier. Now, telling people to stop, especially athletes, I find they just don't want to stop taking NSAIDs because they need them. They like the pain control. But maybe studies like this can get some people's attention. In this case, NSAIDs was tied to men's sexual performance. The rate of erectile dysfunction was 35% for those men who took NSAIDs and 24 who didn't. So there's a 1.22 fold greater likelihood of erectile dysfunction when they're taking NSAIDs. So, you can show this study to your male patients and maybe, you can get them to stop taking NSAIDs. It probably works a little better than telling them about intestinal permeability. Now, DMARDs are generally touted as safe for the long term, but there's a lot more side effects than are regularly reported. In one study, 36% of patients stopped treatment because of some kind of adverse effect. Most commonly, GI symptoms, liver function tests, they go up, other hematological, respiratory, skin reactions. There's a lot of complications and side effects. Biologics can have, we talked about the anti-drug antibodies that they make that can stop them from working and cause allergic reactions. But biologics, if we look at clinical trials and post-marketing surveillance information, they can have infusion site reactions. Anytime you irreversibly inhibit the immune system, you're going to definitely be at higher risk for infections. So, bacterial, fungal, viral infections, those are all big deals with biologics. Even demyelinating disease, heart failure, malignancy, of course, that also happens when you suppress the immune system. And also they've been shown to induce autoimmunity. So that's kind of, you're using them to treat autoimmunity, and now you're inducing it. Corticosteroids, I think we're really familiar with some of the side effects of long-term corticosteroids. If you've ever seen someone who's taken prednisone for a long time, you start to see, that Cushing syndrome, right? So you see the thinning skin, they can bruise really easily, you get muscle weakness, and you get these fatty deposits in the face. So their face looks like kind of this moon puffy face that they get stretch marks and acne, that's all that Cushing syndrome. And also, it thins their bones. It can lead to diabetes and high blood pressure and their wound healing, delayed wound healing. And of course, anytime you suppress the immune system, you risk infection and mood changes. And you can see all of the other things, including sleep and other things that long-term corticosteroids can do. So not definitely one you want to be on for a long time. So I hope I've convinced you that, the pharmaceutical approach, even though it can be beneficial in the short term, and, if someone has a severe flare of rheumatoid arthritis and their joints are being damaged, there's nothing wrong with using one of these medications to stop that destruction. But don't stop there. You want to still now also do that foundational functional treatment approach so that they can get off that medication, hopefully, and prevent those long-term side effects. So let's jump to a polling question. What are some of those foundational functional treatment approaches? Now, we've just spent, a day and a half going through a lot of these. Optimized blood sugar, love it. Definitely. Phytonutrients, absolutely. Those are really big. Diet, yep, that's a foundation. Diet, good. Any more details? What else? Acupuncture, phytonutrients, definitely. Curcumin, yep, you've looked ahead. We're going to go over that one. Omega-3s, yes, big one. Optimize blood sugar, heal the gut, yeah. Movement, oil, this is great. Okay, now they're coming in. Awesome. Elimination diet, yep, eliminate toxins, fix leaky gut, fish oil. Absolutely. Gut health. That's really important. Diet, sleep, stress. Yes, I think you guys got it. Those are the foundations. Absolutely. Anti-inflammatory diet, address triggers. Yeah, so we start by looking at those triggers, right? Those antecedents, triggers, mediators. We take a good history. We fill in the timeline. And remember that we want to work more upstream to identify, more upstream rather than downstream. It's just much, once you're down that waterfall, it's a lot harder to stop. So address those upstream triggers that initiate and perpetuate inflammation. So remember the key driver, I think you guys got that on the word cloud, of inflammation and anti-inflammation is diet. And then the lifestyle factors, the sleep, the stress, those are so foundational. So we're going to jump into the the botanical modulators right now and talk about them, but I really want to stress that they work best when you put them on top of that foundation. So start with the foundation, start with all those, the diet, the lifestyle, that's critical. And then these botanicals are going to work better. I want to get you thinking away from this concept of green medicine. Now, instead of using an NSAID, I'm going to use curcumin. Now, even though that can be valuable, it probably causes a less damage, you're going to get a much better effect when you actually start and build that on top of the foundation. So you could try to eat healthy like this, right? I try to eat healthy and never sprinkle salt on ice cream. I only eat decaffeinated pizza, so I'm sure Dan would not like that pizza. And my beer is 100% fat-free. So you can kind of do that. Or you can kind of do this. So this is really, I've gone over this. This is here just to remind you, decrease the arachidonic acid, increase omega-3s, optimize that 6:3 ratio, make sure you get adequate cofactors for those desaturase enzymes. Here's another one, just a hint for you guys that are taking the certification. You've seen this one many times now. Just not only, it stresses the importance of it, so how important it is to balance fatty acids. Also the antioxidants, phytonutrients, which you guys said in the word cloud, get rid of those hydrogenated fats, the simple sugars, alcohol, refined carbohydrates. That's all going to optimize blood glucose regulation. And then your toolkit has all of these resources for your patients to help make those dietary changes. So, it says they revise the food pyramid again, eat whatever you want. Nobody listens to us anyway. I hope that, with the help of the toolkit, that your patients are going to heed your advice a little bit more readily than that. So once the anti-inflammatory diet is established, you've taken care of dysbiosis and leaky gut, and we're going to talk about how to do that tomorrow. The final foundational functional treatment program is to incorporate a combination of several of these anti-inflammatory botanical and phytochemical agents. And that's going to help to modulate the inflammatory cascade. And it does that through multiple synergistic activities. So plants, they've been popular sources of pain remedies in just about every culture for thousands of years. And just like foods, they've been shown to modulate that inflammatory cascade through multiple different mechanisms. And some of these are here, very similar to the way foods do it. These botanicals can also act on these different pathways. So again, you've seen this before. So there's that NF-kappa B in the nucleus. And this time, when you start to use phytochemicals and immune modulators, what that'll do is, it'll downregulate some of the cytokines and some of these more inflammatory pathways. And it'll also upregulate the more anti-inflammatory pathways like the PPARs and the NRF2, the ones that produce the sort of the endogenous antioxidant activity. So plants are modulators, which is really, and these plants, these botanicals that we're going to talk about. And many of these botanicals work upstream. So we've talked a lot about NF-kappa B. We know that NF-kappa B is activated by all of these different triggers, whether it's oxidative stress, infections, and that it goes into the nucleus. It dissociates from I-kappa B. When it's stuck to I-kappa B, it's not working. When it dissociates, it goes into the nucleus and turns on all of those genes. And so here it is again, just in a nice graphic form. You've got NF-kappa B associated with I-kappa B. When you have the trigger, that inflammatory insult comes in. I-kappa B dissociates, which allows it to go to the nucleus. And a transcription factor, all that is that there's a place in the DNA where that protein binds. And when it binds, it brings the RNA polymerase there, and that RNA polymerase then starts to make RNA, which then gets translated into proteins. And those are the inflammatory proteins that this one binds to. So the important point is that these anti-inflammatory nutraceuticals, they downregulate NF-kappa B expression and other inflammatory pathways, but they don't block that basal activity, right? We need inflammation. We need it to heal wounds. We need it to fight infections. That's really important. So, but we don't want it to be so high that it's going to drive inflammation. So plants are kind of that sweet spot. And they're much safer in the long term, and they can be used for chronic inflammatory conditions. And, they affect many different pathways. But there are a lot of botanicals and phytochemicals out there. So which ones do you use? There's just so many. Some of these have been used in cultures for hundreds and thousands of years. They have a pretty good safety profile. So if we look at some of them, this is definitely not an extensive, exhaustive list, but these are some of the botanicals and phytochemicals that have been shown to have anti-inflammatory properties. I'm not going to read them all, but you can see them there. These are some of the botanicals that have COX modulatory properties. So they modulate that cyclooxygenase enzyme. Some of them are foods that you can get in your diet, and some are a little harder to get in your diet. These ones modulate the LOX, lipoxygenase. And these ones modulate NF-kappa B. And you probably noticed that there's some botanicals that were in all of those lists, that we just showed you. So clearly that points to the fact that these botanicals and foods can have multiple different effects. So how do you start to choose between these botanicals, these phytochemicals? Well, all of those that we just listed that were in those lists they have GRAS status. So that's generally regarded as safe. So that's a status that the FDA confers. Now they're considered safe, but we don't necessarily understand them all that well. Now, even though I started out the talk by saying that there's a lot more studies and really well-designed studies, this whole field of herbal medicine and botanicals, there's a lot of benefit to them, but they're not without risk. So always, just because you're switching to a botanical doesn't mean that it's safe and you can give as much as you need for as long as you want. Right? There's a lot of variability in how herbs are prepared, the different compounds. Is a herb, is it the root? Is it the stem? Is it the leaf? What part of the herb do you even start with? How is it prepared? Is it extracted? Is it the whole plant? Is it an extraction? What percent is that extraction? Is it a 10, a 20%? There's a lot of lack of uniformity across the different manufacturers, and sometimes it can be really hard to determine which product is best and whether it's safe to use. So really start, these products are starting to be standardized now, and I think that's a really good thing. We can start to look at that. So any botanical that you want to use should kind of meet these criteria. So it should have a history of low toxicity in long-term use. Now, a lot of them that have been used for hundreds, thousands of years, I think they meet that criteria. It should have sufficient research, both in vitro, in vivo, so not just mouse, but in vivo human as well, that suggests clinically useful anti-inflammatory activity and kind of where it might act on those different pathways. Should work upstream if possible, and it should be available as a standardized extract that we talked about. So we're going to focus on these, beauties. You can see turmeric there and ginger, and the plants I had quercetin, boswellia. These are the ones we're going to talk about. So let's just jump in real quick to a polling question and ask, what anti-inflammatory phytochemicals and botanicals are you using clinically right now to decrease inflammation? Turmeric, bromelain, excellent. Any quercetin? Okay, curcumin, there's a big one. Yeah, curcumin, turmeric, they're the same. Curcumin's the active form that you want to go for from turmeric. Omega-3s, okay, good. Boswellia, bromelain, any other? Devil's claw, I see. Ginger, excellent. Anything else? Turmeric. Okay. Did we cover ginger? Boswellia, willow, resveratrol, spirulina. Okay, some of the foods, excellent. Pomegranate, licorice, green tea, good. I finished my green tea earlier. So I'm on to water now. Okay, excellent. So it looks like some of you, capsaicin, CBD, good. So it looks like skullcap, I see. It looks like we're going to cover a lot of them that you guys already said. You can see these are the ones we're going to cover today. And you can see their scientific name. So let's start with turmeric. It's estimated turmeric's been used for probably 2,000 years. It's a common ingredient in Asian foods. It's been used in medicine, in fabric dyeing. Marco Polo actually talked about turmeric in his memoirs. And the herb was actually brought from India to Europe during the medieval times. It was used as a colorant. You can see with its beautiful color, no wonder. And a folk remedy. So, definitely it's been used for GI upset, arthritis, and overall kind of just fatigue and body energy. And it's such a nice color. It makes foods look really good. And it's very common in curries. And it also plays a role in religious ceremonies in India. So it's cultivated mostly in India, but it's also in Central America. You can find it growing. So turmeric contains these active polyphenols called curcuminoids. And these curcuminoids, they actually have over 100 different molecular targets. They can modify genes and epigenetics. They affect cell signaling pathways. They downregulate the NF-kappa B, NOx, LOX, INOS, MMPs, the different cytokines. And they also upregulate NRF2. So, I think it's probably easier to ask what the curcumin and turmeric doesn't do than what it does. It's just such a wide range of actions. And again, it's an excellent stimulator of NRF2. And this is just a nice summary for you to show that NRF2 is one of those good guys that will turn on all of those antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, even detoxification genes. It's sort of the NRF2, you can kind of think of it as that cellular, sort of the master regulator of cellular redox homeostasis. And so these are conditions where you can think about using curcumin. I mean, there's again, almost every patient you see, you should consider using curcumin because it can be very effective. And it's such a great tool to have in your toolkit, from fatigue to cardiotoxicity, Parkinson's, asthma, of course, diabetes, all of the different autoimmune diseases. This is just one study. There's a ton of studies out there on curcumin, but in this one, curcumin given with mesalamine was much better than mesalamine alone in actually inducing remission in active ulcerative colitis. So, these guys said curcumin may be a safe and promising agent for treatment of ulcerative colitis, which I would definitely agree with. So there's a lot more studies on curcumin that you can look at, but typically you want a dose of about 750 to 1500 milligrams a day, and look for that standardization to the curcuminoids, about 90 to 95%. Curcumin is very safe. Doses of 2 and 2.5 grams per kilogram have been fed to rats and also guinea pigs and monkeys with really no evidence of harm or genetic damage at all. And so, use it for, like we showed you, most inflammatory related conditions. Put it as a spice in their food. Make these turmeric lattes. That's one for you, Dan. That goes really nicely with your caffeine. Use it in autoimmune diseases. Use it as a supplement. You really can't go wrong with the curcumin. Ginger, again, used in Chinese, Japanese, Indian medicine since the 1500s, traditional Ayurvedic remedy. If you look at a lot of products that affect the GI tract, digestive products, antitussives, anti-flatulence, laxatives, antacids, a lot of them contain ginger, that oleo resin of ginger. So it's really good for the GI tract. And usually what's good for the GI tract is going to benefit our microbiome, and by extension, it's going to benefit inflammation. And we're going to go into that a little bit more tomorrow. But ginger has also had a long history of use as an anti-inflammatory, and it can affect, NF-kappa B, cyclooxygenase, also activates PPAR, and it activates, it inhibits reactive oxygen species generating enzymes. Now, there's a lot of different components of the ginger, so this is one where, like, it's the 6-gingerol that blocks NF-kappa B. It's the 8 and the 10 gingerol that will dose-dependently inhibit LPS, induced production of nitric oxide. And so there's different components of the ginger. And so we're still really trying to get a sense of which one is the most important to standardize for. But like curcumin, ginger, you really should consider it in almost all inflammatory related conditions. Use it again as a food, as a supplement, just use pretty liberally. There may be some evidence, there is some evidence in a study, it's used specifically for osteoarthritis. There was a study for 261 patients, a 6-week study. They took ginger, they didn't. And the guys taking ginger, they could walk better. They took less pain medication. All of their osteoarthritis, the standardized osteoarthritis indexes improved when they took the ginger. So again, 500 to about 1,000 milligrams 3 times a day. Again, we were still not quite standardized on what you want to standardize it for, because there's 4, 2, 4, 6, 8 gingerols, but it looks like a kind of a 5% gingerol is what looks like is the best. Again, 4 grams, very few side effects. Now, even though we know it's used to treat gastrointestinal upset, taking too much can cause some gastrointestinal upset, and it may inhibit platelet aggregation. So, that's probably a good thing when you're looking at cardiovascular disease, but it does have a theoretical bleeding risk. Okay, let's keep going. This is Indian frankincense, or boswellia, and that's the resin of boswellia. And boswellia, again, another one that's been used for hundreds of years in Africa and India, another big component of Ayurvedic medicine, and again, used to treat a lot of inflammatory diseases. And we use the extract of that resin that I just showed you. It has anti-inflammatory mechanisms, highly specific inhibitor of 5-lipoxygenase and NF-kappa B inhibition as well. Again, there's the LOX and the COX pathways, and you can see where turmeric, ginger, boswellia, and ginger here work on the COX and the LOX pathways. So, you'd want to use boswellia anywhere where that prostaglandin leukotriene pathways are really contributing to significant inflammation. which applies to a lot of inflammatory conditions, but think about the leukotrienes in asthma, think about osteoarthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis. That's where boswellia is very commonly used. Look at about 300 to 400 milligrams, again, 3 times a day, and you want it standardized to the boswellic acids. Okay, so anywhere between 37 to 65% boswellic acids. And again, boswellia has very low toxicity when it's administered orally. This is bromelain, so the nice pineapple. Now, bromelain is actually found in the stem part of the pineapple. Now, that stem used to be considered a waste product, right? Just thrown into the compost bin. But back in 1957, Ralph Heineke, he worked as a chemist for the Dole Pineapple Company. He actually discovered bromelain in these stems, and he found this enzyme. Now, Ralph was encouraged by the Dole Pineapple Company to actually find some kind of use for this enzyme, some type of medicinal use. And, that would probably be a lot better for the bottom line than throwing all of this out. So turns out Ralph was pretty successful in finding uses for it. And I think we're all grateful to Ralph and to the Dole Pineapple Company for coming and finding bromelain. So bromelain is a proteolytic enzyme. It has anti-inflammatory and analgesic properties, so great for pain control. Inhibits thromboxane, bradykinin, fibrinolytic activity. So really great for post-surgery and wounds and things like that. With the bradykinin, I know Dr. Browntree talked a little bit about that with COVID. We may want to consider bromelain as well. So post-surgery and any kind of trauma, it's really great for tissue inflammation. Sinusitis as well. These are all of the studies where bromelain has been shown to have an effect. Different types of surgery, from orthopedics to ophthalmology and obstetrics. In all cases, bromelain was great at reducing post-surgery inflammation and had a beneficial effect. So, just with all these amazing uses of bromelain, I wonder why we don't use it more often. So you want to take bromelain on an empty stomach because it's an enzyme. You don't want it just digesting your food. You want it to be absorbed. So it's definitely important to take it on an empty stomach. 250 to 750 milligrams 3 times a day. Now this one's standardized to 1800, 2400 MCU. MCU is just a way of measuring proteolytic enzymes. So it stands for milk clot units. So 1 milk clot unit is the amount of enzyme that clots 2 milliliters of the specific milk substance in 180 minutes. So that's just a way of standardizing that enzymatic activity. Sometimes you'll see casein digestion units, or CDU, or bromelain tyrosine units, or BTU. Sometimes those are used as well. Very low toxicity, doses up to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight with no toxicity at all. Doses of 1.5 grams per kilogram daily showed no carcinogenic effect in rats. If you are what you eat, I'd rather be thin like a French fry than round like a head of lettuce. So, there's ways to justify one's diet. All right, devil's claw. You can kind of see where it gets its name, right? I think this is actually a really beautiful plant despite its name. Another great one to have in your toolkit. It comes from South Africa. Again, another one of those that's been used for hundreds of years traditionally. These are, if they've been used that long, clearly they must be effective. And so that's why these are the ones we tend to look at. Its anti-inflammatory activity was observed back in the 1900s, and it really gained a lot of use in Western Europe after those initial trials were published. So back in the 70s and 80s, people realized that it was effective and started using it. And you can see why. It inhibits NF-kappa B, inhibits LPS-induced mRNA levels, lowers COX, and also inducible nitric oxide. Again, multiple different effects. When would you use devil's claw? Probably, any type of joint disease, osteoarthritis, low back pain. Those are all really good. Standardize it 400 to 600 milligrams TID. And this one's standardized to the harpagosides. So you're aiming for 50 to 100 milligrams of harpagosides. Again, very, very safe. Quercetin, these are all foods that have a lot of quercetin in them. Quercetin's a flavanol. So flavanol is one of 6 subclasses of flavonoids, and they're found in lots of different foods, apples, berries, onions, etc., and so on. You can see that. It inhibits PLA2, so that then it blocks LOX and COX. It's a very potent inhibitor of TGF alpha induced COX activity, and it also inhibits histamine release from mast cells and basophils. And this is where reason we use it a lot in allergy type symptoms, is because it can stabilize those mast cells. So these are different foods that are high in quercetin. And you can see, even though we say onions are really one of the high ones, you can see that onions here are, they do have it, but definitely black elderberry, oregano, capers, those are much higher, but these are all foods that are high in quercetin. And this tells you about the different flavonoids. So these are the different classes of flavonoids, and quercetin being a flavanol. So it can get a little complicated. It's just like a basic backbone structure with different sort of molecular additions that changes the classes. And sometimes you'll see them called aglycones. So those are sugar molecules added to them. And use quercetin anytime you have any type of atopic disease and allergy. 500 to 1,000 TID, again, pretty safe. I know that there was some question of its mutagenicity on the Ames test, but in 1999, it was considered non-carcinogenic to humans. So again, relatively safe. This is some of the higher concentrations of quercetin can trigger these pro-apoptotic pathways, and it can initiate this programmed cell death by inducing endoplasmic reticulum stress. So it has some interesting effects. It can modulate heat shock proteins. So a really interesting compound. I think that we're learning a lot more about. Capsaicin, just in the interest of time, I'm going to go very quickly through this. But this is one where it's used topically. So we're looking for that topical analgesic effect, where we use the cayenne and the capsaicin that comes in the cayenne, and it really inhibits that substance P. So pain, as you know, you can see in this picture better, you have some type of injury or stress, you get these noxious mediators, prostaglandins, bradykinin, histamine, that then affects the nerve cell and produces pain. And so what capsaicin does is actually interferes with this particular pathway. Get that. So you can use it again topically. You can take it orally if you like. That's not where you're going to get the effect, but you can use it topically as a plaster in low back pain, diabetic neuropathy. It works quite well. So it's a topical plaster, and you can see that here. Again, very safe to use. So just in interest of time, we'll sort of skip this polling question, but we can come back to that in the Q&A. So green tea, another one of those really amazing anti-inflammatories, and it's one of the reasons I drink it all the time. But green tea has a lot of polyphenols and flavonols as well that are in there. The big one we talk about is EGCG. It works on heart disease, cancer, and neurodegenerative diseases, arthritis. Very potent anti-inflammatory molecule. And you can see that green tea affects a lot of different pathways. These are all from different studies that were done, including LOX and COX and NF-kappa B as well. Again, EGCG can regulate, mitigate a lot of risk factors in cardiovascular disease as well. So you want to use it in most inflammatory conditions. You drink it, as a beverage. You can use it as a cancer prevention. Typical dose of the EGCG is about 200 milligrams 3 times a day, standardized EGCG. Sometimes if you drink too much of it, or sometimes if you drink green tea on an empty stomach, it can cause a little bit of nausea. Quercetin and fish oil can increase its bioavailability. So, take your fish oil maybe with a cup of green tea. And then if you pair your EGCG supplement with a cup of green tea, then you can get all 4 of those catechins together. 1 cup is about 20 to 85 milligrams of EGCG in 1 cup of green tea. Steep it 3 to 5 minutes. If you steep it longer, it becomes a little bitter and you don't get any more of the benefit of getting more EGCG out. And remember, it also contains caffeine. So our last one is CBD. There's some really interesting information on this, and we're going to go a little quickly, but we can answer more of it in the Q&A if you'd like. But it's much more interesting now because it's no longer legal. Canada's legalized it across the board. The Farm Bill Act made CBD legal in all states. And the reason CBD is there is it acts on, we have an endocannabinoid system, right? Endocannabinoids are naturally occurring fatty acids. So they're made from arachidonic acid. So that's the one, you still need some of it. It's made, these natural endocannabinoids are made from arachidonic acid, and then they bind to the CB receptors. And they can regulate inflammation. So the CB1 and CB2 receptors have been found on immune cells, and they have very potent anti-inflammatory effects through inducing apoptosis, inhibiting cell proliferation, and inducing Treg cells. And these endocannabinoids, neurotransmitters that bind to the cannabinoid receptors in the nervous system, that's what we call them. And CBD actually doesn't bind directly to the endocannabinoid receptors, but it seems to cause our endogenous endocannabinoids to bind more. So you can see where these receptors are located. CB1 is a lot in the brain, and CB2 is, you find those receptors very much on the immune system. So majority in the brain, CB2 is more peripherally in the immune system. Just a little bit of endocannabinoids and phytocannabinoids. So, the hemp plant, it's a shame that we don't have more research on this because, it's just been illegal for so long. It was a Category 1 banned substance. So that also prevented research from being done on it. And it's a shame because I think now we're just starting to get those research studies. And it's showing a really amazing effect for immune system and as an anti-inflammatory. So a lot of it is in I'm just going to jump over this and just talk about, the whole hemp extract also has terpenes and other things in it, and it's used in a lot of different conditions. And it can turn on those SPMs, or those specialized pro-resolving lipid mediators. So those are also made from arachidonic acid. So lots of promise there. And just to sum up, don't forget the diet. Don't forget some foundational dietary supplements. This one, you have a rare condition called good health. Frankly, I just don't know how to treat it. Hopefully we all get our patients to that point. Remember that those phytochemicals and immune modulators have multiple synergistic actions. That's it as a summary slide for you to refer to if you want to know where they work. These are the NF-kappa B ones. And there's your cheat sheet to know how much to use for your patients. So you print this one out so you have that one available for you. And so just, the importance of using botanicals and phytonutrients. So thank you.